Welcome back to the Biblical Justice Resources podcast. As we continue thinking through a definition for biblical justice, I want to come back to an idea that I shared last week. The idea that there are some things that can only be learned through action. This is true of biblical justice. There are some aspects of justice that can only be learned either through our own action or by learning from people who have been doing the work of justice. Our guest today is one such person. Michelle Ferrigno Warren is the president of Virago Strategies, a consulting group which provides strategic engagement and project management support for churches and nonprofits stepping more deeply into the work of public justice. I first met Michelle when I took her course on political advocacy at Denver Seminary, and then followed that up by interning with her when she was the Advocacy and Strategic Engagement Director with the CCDA. I've gotten to see firsthand the ways in which she has been a fierce advocate for justice, and I'm so thankful and excited that you'll get to hear about some of that work today. Through our conversation, you'll learn more about Michelle's insights from 30 years as a practitioner, what it looks like to move from charity to justice, and how we can faithfully work and serve alongside communities in the long work of justice, even when we're scared. Now, if you will, join me for this conversation with Michelle Ferrigno Warren. My name's Eric, and this is the Biblical Justice Resources podcast. Our conversation will begin right after this. The Biblical Justice Resources podcast is supported by listeners like you at patreon.com/biblicaljusticeresources. If you're interested in supporting the podcast and helping to resource individuals and the church for the pursuit of biblical justice, please consider giving today at patreon.com/biblicaljusticeresources. Again, visit patreon.com/biblicaljusticeresources to help support the podcast. Now on with the show. Michelle, thank you for joining me today. As we've been starting off these initial conversations here on the podcast, I've been asking people to start off what their definition of biblical justice is or how they understand it. So do you have a set definition, or how do you think of biblical justice?
Yeah, I mean, I've got many sermons on it and a lot of writing on it, but sort of the quicker response is in parallel to the Hebrew word mishpat, which is the Hebrew word for justice, which really in its essence means to restore people to their most productive place. And it's not just about an individual spiritual productivity. And as you look through the Old Testament, it's not just about an individual, but it's societal. So anything that works towards the restoration and the productivity of people, creation, for back to their original intent.
Yeah. And then you have a variety of experience vocationally. We're talking a little bit about it offline, and that's how I met you, through some of that experience. So we'll kind of walk through a couple of different things. What is your entry into working with biblical justice? I kind of have a little bit of an understanding of that background, but what does that look like from your perspective?
Yeah, I'm gonna name drop a little bit because I remember being on tour with my first book with the Power of Proximity. And you kind of put yourself out there, and there's not just one circumstance that it was. For me, it was a journey. And I was in Grand Rapids speaking at this church about the power of proximity, and the lights were really, really bright. And I remember they took questions from the audience, and it was dark, and I didn't see people, and there were a fair amount of more senior leaders in the community. And a gentleman stood up and said, how did you know to move from charity to justice? And I thought that was probably the most articulate question I'd ever been. Like, felt like I may be on CNBC. That was like, wow, that takes a lot of thought. I didn't write about that explicitly in my book or talk. Where is this coming from? And then I just shared, and I'll answer the question, and then I'll kind of wrap it around to who asked me that question. And I remember stopping and saying, I've never been asked that question. And let me think about it. And I said, I knew to move from charity, which is giving handouts, seeing people in need, loving mercy, caring for the poor, the widow, the orphan, in that expression. And even in those experiences, starting with kind of learning about it, donating my time. I didn't have very much money when I was younger, but donating what I could, giving to it. And in that very proximate relationship, and then moving into the community, I began to see a bigger perspective. And it wasn't that I was like, wow, this is, I'm going to get on the bandwagon for justice. And I didn't start searching the scriptures. My heart was just really, really broken from all I was experiencing as a neighbor. I was a seventh grade math teacher. Nothing was really lining up. And it was because I had come from a system that worked. I came from sort of that other side of the community at that when I saw injustice, I didn't have that language, but I knew there was another way to have flourishing. And so as I answered that question, I was like, it was because I saw it and I experienced it and I felt it and I saw injustice. And that's how I moved, because my love was obviously loving mercy, but it was almost like a moral outrage that people didn't have access, that there were barriers, and that no matter what we even did, I was a seventh grade math teacher, it didn't matter how many math tables we learned, this was not going to reverse the deep level of injustice that was happening. So when I saw injustice, I began to ask deeper questions and then search in scripture. And honestly, I was very delighted to see that the entire central theme of the Old Testament is justice and love, and Jesus's whole purpose in coming was the salvific work to the justice of God, and that we as the people of God from the early church to this day, we do that depositing of good work in the world, which is about restoration, bringing peace so that there can be justice. So I answered the question much shorter. Of course, I was on stage, and then the moderator said, Michelle, you don't know this because it's dark, but that was Nick Wolterstorff. And I was like, I know him. I know him. He's pretty renowned. And I smiled and I was like, huh, well, I'm really glad, Nick, to meet you. And I'm sure glad I didn't know you were in the audience when I started. So for
Right.
those of you who are new, you need to look into the Quartet of the Vulnerable and Nick Wolterstorff. He is quite a legacy.
Yeah. His book is somewhere behind me. Well, one of his books, I think it's literally just called Justice. So it's a pretty. I feel like he was a little academically minded, if I remember correctly. It came up in a seminary class, so maybe not the best starting point, but definitely a good place to get to. So bring up a good point about this difference between justice and charity. Can you maybe define charity then in that the way you were thinking of it and how it plays off of or against its relationship with justice?
Yeah. Charity and justice are all encompassed in love. When we love as we love ourselves, when we love God, we care about the restoration of people, of places, of societies, of systems. And charity is a good word to explain one part of love, which is what I'd say loving mercy. When you see a problem and you respond to it, you are expressing love. You are caring. You're opening your eyes to the problem. It's much like, the parable of the Good Samaritan. You're like, I'm not going to walk by the half dead, beaten up man on the side of the road, literally and figuratively, that I want to love mercy and I want to do charity. And that's a really important, I would say it's an important first step, and it's transformational, both for the receiver as well as the individual. It also feels good right away. Like I would I would donate my time. I mean, and maybe your audience is donating their time to feed hungry people. That feels really good. But after a while, that actually isn't love. And there's some debate on should we stop doing mercy and helping them so that when helping doesn't hurt them and it really helps them. I think it really gets to the question is then what does love look like beyond charity? responding to a problem when we see it. And that gets you into that second part with doing justice. And doing justice means I care enough to go beyond this immediate moment and ask the questions of what is broken, what is in need of repair, what is needing to be restored so that nobody has to be hungry. And so they work together. And you see that, of course, through the Old Testament, because the Hebrew is so distinct that you see the words righteousness and justice. And righteousness, while it's not exclusively to loving mercy, that Hebrew word tzedakah means right actions towards someone. And so I kind of think of it that my demonstration of my right acts towards you, but the reason it's hinged with mishpat, or that righteousness and justice, is my right actions towards you become justice for everyone. And so we as Christians are called to be salt and light in the world. I'm sorry, getting over a cold. And do that righteousness that becomes justice. And so that is sort of that distinctive. You can't really do one well without the other. If you just try to right the wrongs without knowing the person, then you are missing the loving of justice. If you leave people at charity, then it's more about you and not doing that hard, really pressing work. There's a very famous quote from a Brazilian priest, and I'm not recalling his name right now, but he was known for his generous acts of charity and his intentional work towards justice, which came later. For me too, it came later. And he said, when I gave the hungry something to eat, they called me a saint. But when I asked why the poor were hungry, they called me a communist. The work of justice asks those questions no matter what you're labeled, because people should not be hungry. People should not be without homes. And we need to ask those hard questions on why do we have this broken place and what can we do for the work of repair.
Yeah. So, what does that look like for you in your journey? I know we'll get into some of the. I guess this is going to be the place where we get into the organization that you started in Denver and other aspects of the work that you've done. So, what has that look like for you? And it sounds like there was an aspect of moving from charity work to justice work. So, all of that put together, what does that look like for you?
So here's the crazy thing, Eric. I didn't have any of the language when I was walking that journey. And so here I am, all these decades later, and I have the opportunity to teach at Denver Seminary. You were part of one of those classes. I taught a class called Social Concerns and Community Development, really to help equip pastors that were emerging, as well as faith leaders in my journey. So I'm going to share a little bit of what I call the quadrants of Christian discipleship. And I did not come up with these quadrants. It's kind of a known thing, especially in the Christian community development world. But this is the best way I can frame that journey, which is grew up in the church. I was even a Christian school kid, graduated from Cedarville University, loved God with all my heart, with all my soul, with all my mind, with all my strength. At least I wanted to. And I wanted to love my neighbor as myself, but I was a super good Pharisee, because that was just sort of how I was trained. So I had to get rid of all of that, but a lot of that. But all to say that first quadrant was really the birthplace of my own love for God and what did it mean to love my neighbor as myself. And that meant I was going to go outside those four walls of the church. And as I did, it naturally went to charity work. I kind of talked about that a little bit, where I'm loving mercy, and that would be that second quadrant. So we are kind of birthed into our relationship with God. His Spirit, connects us to Him. We are connected to the body of Christ, and we have this, community, the church community that really equips us, sustains us, and it's not something that you ever really leave. But that quadrant, as you love God, to love God means you're going to love neighbors. So you're going to go outside it. And that second quadrant would be in that loving mercy. I've already kind of stepped through how, as you love very, very deeply, you begin to realize we need something more, which what I call is the third quadrant of community development, where really that long-standing relationship in the community work, in solidarity, working together. You're not ever doing things to people, you're not doing them for them, but you're doing it with them so that they can do it by themselves. But it was in that quadrant of community development. And you're right, I moved to Denver about 30 years ago and started a transitional home for homeless teens. And the next year, my husband, myself, and a couple other people started with Open Door Ministries. And Open Door Ministries has been around for a long time. It was a great idea of some 20 somethings. And I'm pretty convinced that if anybody had known what it would become, they never would have let a 25 and 26-year-old start it. But, it was more like knock yourselves out. And we had our first year operating budget was $60,000. And now it's about 4.5 million. It has, about 55 staff and numerous programs, and it has a very big footprint for community development, which is justice work. It has both the hinge of loving mercy with some outreach, but really is known for the deep solidarity in the church. We have a community church that is dreaming together what they can become together and really walking alongside each other through transitional housing, employment opportunities. I mean, there's just a lot at Open Door Ministries. And so that is really the quadrant that I was in. But because I had been a teacher and because I had been, in a transitional house and working alongside people through doing much of what social workers do, I just, it's just sort of an accompaniment and understanding systems and trying to get people a way forward. It was very apparent we were losing all the time. And I had asked all those hard questions and realized, there is something deeper and wider than individual choice and even a social response like community development, that there were barriers, sort of the fish, give a person a fish leap for a day, teach a person to fish, they'll fish for a lifetime. And I'm like, and then there's the third part, which is, you need access to the pond. Or they'll say, oh, well, there's access, but you only can come in the heat of the day for these 2 hours, and the fee is this much, and you don't have a car, so you're gonna, it's just like, oh, it's so much work to try to put your line in the water and fish when everybody knows you never fish at 4 in the afternoon. Like, it's just not going to be a smart time. And, you don't have the right reel. Like, it's a miracle if it ever works. And so those barriers really were frustrating myself. They were frustrating my husband, David, and our community, because we finally were growing in our own sense of power. And awareness and our own individual and collective advocacy. Like, we want more, that we all woke up. And that's when I decided to go to night school and I got my degree in policy. So it was really just to come back to my community to see how we could change public policies. Law and policy, they're a little distinct, but those are barriers. Those are two things that you can do to lift barriers. And so that led me into that fourth and final quadrant, which was the confrontation of injustice, that it's not okay if there aren't access. Like, we need to fight for access for our own well-being, for our own growth. And that's actually where I spend a majority of my time now. Not because I don't think each of those four quadrants are really, really important. I don't know if you know this about me, but I was a musician and I've been a worship pastor for over 2 decades. And when you are part of a congregation and you bring the whole community and you have a lot of fun, it's hard to see your worship pastor sit down in the congregation and say, I'm not going to do this anymore. And it wasn't because I was trying to be willful, but there were plenty of people who could work inside the four walls of the church. And even that first step, it's not too hard to get people to donate a can or a coat or even go down and feed a meal. But that community development is hard. And there's certain strengthening that needs to happen in mentoring, which, I'm always going to do. But there's almost no one. And I don't mean this in like this Elijah moment. There's just a remnant. There is a remnant that is set apart. I keep thinking of other remnants like the sons of Issachar. I'm thinking of the remnant that's in Amos 5, the tribe of Joseph. There are certain groups, and Elijah, of course, and all of those people that he didn't even know we're not worshiping Baal, that there's a Mordecai moment, where you just realize there's going to be a small group of us that need to move into a much more prophetic space. That advocacy work and confronting injustice is both the prophetic word and the prophetic work of the church. Sometimes you don't need a ton of prophets, but it would be helpful for those who are prophets to be listened to be followed. But as we know, usually they're burned, at the stake, stoned. This is 2025. Nobody really does that in the United States, but they do cut off their funding and they do label them. So I don't know how much more you want me to go. I mean, obviously I have stories, but that's really the progression. That was my own experience that I've seen, and actually that I teach and disciple people in public theology all the way to public engagement.
Yeah, I think it's all really good, and we can keep going on that. But I'm really glad you brought up the prophetic piece, because I have been musing on a thing, and I would be interested to hear your thoughts on this. So you were just a part of a webinar series that I did for my day job that was not maybe as well attended as we would have hoped otherwise with the way things worked. But we feel like the information we were talking about really is important for the church to be thinking about. We were talking about politics, and you specifically were talking about advocacy. And it brought up a question for me of what is the difference between, so if we say the church needs to be talking about this, what is the difference between a prophetic voice and a paternalistic voice of saying, we need to be talking about this even if you don't want to, or it is important for, like, what is the relationship there? Because I have been going back and forth about trying to figure out how to think about that.
Yeah. We don't need any more talking. We need action. And that's kind of why I said having a prophetic voice, but doing something with it is that step. We see that in First John, I think it's First John 3:18. We can't continue to love in words and speeches, but our love needs to be demonstrated in action and in truth. And so, yes, rising up and speaking truth, saying this is not right, this is not just, and just staying there isn't about the work of justice. Awareness isn't justice. Learning about issues is not justice. Preaching about issues, teaching about issues, it isn't the work of justice. The work of justice is when you see it and you engage it. And so, yes, we need people to move from an awareness. I think I've heard that we have a detention center here in Colorado to, oh, wow, it's overflowing, and they have the same food budget that they had 10 years ago, and they don't want to give food to the people who are detained. And now they are literally starving, losing weight so fast over these last couple months. Even as a person like me who has the pulse on all of that, it's not enough for me just to talk about it. What am I going to do about it? And so not everyone's going to do what I'm going to do. So that's why we had that course, because there's a civic engagement. I'm talking about public engagement. There's a distinctive, but civic engagement is beyond voting. Everybody in the United States who is a citizen has the voice, because we're both a democracy and a republic, to use that voice to express their care, their concern, their pushback, their disgruntledness, and to do that on the interests of another versus your own interests, for some reason, is unfamiliar. Like if I get overcharged in my bill, my electric bill, or I'm trying to think of maybe some state thing, fees went up for the Denver Rec Center. Oh, I'm so upset. I'm going to call my person, because for me, I'm going to fight for myself. I don't want to pay extra money. People go to court and like, I didn't know there was a camera there that snapped me. That's wrong. That's kind of fighting for yourself. That's great. That's not prophetic. That's you being human. But what if you took all that moxie and follow what Paul said, which is we don't want to look on the interests of others. We don't want to look on the interests of ourselves, but we want to look on the interests of others. in my voting, in my practice, my opinion. So now I'm hearing that there are hungry people at the detention center. Now, you know me, Eric. I mean, I'm working through the entire Colorado delegation. I got all these faith leaders. And yes, I just found out yesterday, and we happen to have a meeting with Senator Hickenlooper next week, and we will be bringing all of this. But that's almost not enough, because 10 faith leaders with one senator isn't enough. So I'm actually in conversation with many different leaders, and we will be doing what we call a prophetic action in front of the detention center. And vigils are fine and people don't pay attention, but we're making it intergenerational, and we're all bringing food. Basically, we're going to have a huge food bank, and we're going to walk and march and deposit food in front of the detention center with this language. There's a couple things. One, out of our abundance, we give, because as people of faith, we do these three things. We feed hungry people. We care for the immigrant and stranger in our land. And we remember prisoners like we ourselves were in prison. And all of that does seem, now, I don't know if other people need to do that, but I'm just saying, like, these are very practical things to raise awareness, to try to ensure. Now, I don't have control over the rations of what's in a detention center, but as an American citizen, I know my ability to influence senators and House people who do have that oversight and say, we are not going to rest. You can't starve people in this country. So that's just like what's really literally happening these next couple days. And I don't know if everybody has to march and, like I'm a strategic architect. I'm obviously a prophetic voice, but I do think, and this is why I wrote Join the Resistance, is you need to figure out what is your work for the work of justice, to build peace and do that good work that God has called all of his people to do, with his spirit as Christians. What's the work between the elections? What's the work between the marches? Those are little flashpoints that could possibly make it change, but the real work is done every single, month, year after year, as you serve the work and serve the movement. If you care about immigration, you're so aghast at what's happening, donate to nonprofits that are helping with immigrant legal care, whether they're Christian or not. If you want to do more, donate your time. Ask if you can help. Serve the people who are serving those who are impacted by injustice. The second thing is you stay at the table. You don't man, I've been working on immigration for a couple years. I've been, giving myself, I've been donating, and it's just getting worse and worse and worse. Yeah, it might, because the work of justice is never short. That's how I know it's justice. I always say, if you're doing the work of justice, it's long and it's always met with resistance. If you're not met with resistance and it happens quickly, I'm pretty much going to push out and say, I just don't think that's justice work. And that's pretty bold, but I got 30 years under my belt, and I've just never seen it without those two things. So you stay at the table in season and out of season, because God has commanded us to care. In this example, the immigrant. We don't want to be the Levite and the priest, well, yeah, I don't have to care about it this time, or I cared the last time. No, I stay at the table and I stay committed. And sometimes there's personal things that are happening in your life that you have to pull back and start again, but you don't shut down the spirit nudging you. Call that quenching the spirit. We don't shut down those nudges that this just cannot happen the way it is happening. And I need to stay at the table, even though I'm discouraged, even though I'm now working with people I don't even know. They come from different political affiliations. They come from different, thoughts and faiths, sometimes, gender orientation. I don't know. Well, keep staying at the table, do the work. And then the third response is you need to help your people. Don't do any of it in silent. We don't hide light, good, pushing out darkness with light activities, and hide it because I don't want to seem political. I can't tell my family I'm doing this. They would all be upset. No, help your people. Don't scream and yell at them, but invite them into what the good peacemaking work that you're doing. And that is the work of a Christian. That is prophetic work. And that is really vital to solidarity in the body of Christ, where we'll just say there are no haves and have-nots. Everyone needs to be treated with dignity and respect and should have just laws and opportunity for their own and their communities flourishing. But until we do, let's be that bridge and accompany each other together because it's transformational.
Yeah. And I think the point about in season and out of season focus is important too, because I think we can think of something being in season when it comes to light, but that didn't just happen. So being able to continue to push on what for other people may seem out of season is no, we need to continue focusing on this because otherwise this could end up going in a place we don't want it to go. Define that however you may want to.
Yeah.
I'm thinking
Well,
now.
I
Oh,
want to
go
I
ahead.
want to talk a little bit about I'm sorry to cut you off, but I want to tell you this one example about length. So I'm very in tune with many policies. The one I'm known the most for is immigration because it's federal. And so you have to do really big actions. You can't just do small things. The stuff I do at city, county, and state levels are often not seen as much because it doesn't have that national look, link. But just to give you an idea, so I moved into an immigrant community in 97 and I was beginning to wake up a little bit. And while I wasn't working on the DREAM Act when it came out, it wasn't too much farther after that I began aware of it. So working a lot, living, loving, serving immigrants, neighbors, they being served by them, from 97. And then when I was pregnant with my third child, the DREAM Act was introduced. And it is still, I mean, I've been arrested and in the New York Times for the DREAM Act. I mean, like I've done a lot. I bring that up because I mean that's kind of a pretty big deal. You just don't do that kind of thing. So I've done a lot of stuff behind the scenes, obviously in front of many cameras, whatever we need to do for justice. But I've I've been pregnant with my youngest, until now, and it is still not passed. And my youngest just finished his first year as an engineer. He's 23. I mean, this is a long work, but I feel as passionate about it today as I did those decades ago. And that's the unrelenting, uncompromising resistance that we need in our own hearts to not leave the work.
Yeah. This whole conversation has brought to mind a person who may be saying, "This all sounds good, but I don't know where to start."
Mm.
How do you advise people on where to start? Is it, I mean, I think it would start with that, what is the prompting of the Holy Spirit? But if someone is seeing multiple issues or they've got a list of things and we only have so much time to devote to life in general, what does it look like to how do you advise people on finding a place to begin?
Yeah, I mean, Eric, so I waited. I was in work in ministry 24 years before I published my first book. Okay, that's a long time to be silent and not say anything. And it was overtime. It takes a while to sit down and do the work when you're doing it and raising family. But I bring that up because I wanted to write a book on the work of doing justice now. And my editors who had known me for a really long time were like, no, you need to help people. You need to go back and help people because you didn't just get there. And there's a whole group of people who are going to want to understand how do you walk in. And as much as I hated that, Eric, I hated it. I mean, I was like, I can't believe I was a little embarrassed. Like, this is the first book I'm writing, The Power of Proximity. I mean, I don't even want to say that because I don't want to minimize those easy steps, those very difficult early steps. I don't not easy early steps, but I'm like, that's not who I am. But the reality is that is who I am. That is who I was. We are not just in that moment. We are an arc of growth. And so first of all, let me just say, it starts with stepping outside of your comfort zone and doing things scared and being scared that there's just so many injustices in the world and I can't be bogged down. I still have to, do all these things. I can only take one and I'm only going to work on it for 3 years. Don't minimize the prompting of the Spirit. Don't not trust that the one who literally calls himself peace and comforter isn't going to help you with the egregious wrongs of a broken and hurting world. I mean, Jesus will meet you there. So, I wouldn't list I wouldn't write a list to injustice. I would be like that Good Samaritan along the road. God, what are you wanting me to see? So there's a discernment. But the power of proximity literally was written for people who want to take that next step. I've had whole churches all across the country do it together, where they've begun to, and there's a study guide that you can download for free, and it just helps you understand, how do you move from an awareness to injustice to an action that's in solidarity. You already kind of mentioned a little bit of that paternalism, right? And paternalism kind of has this attitude that, well, I have everything I have because I achieved it, I earned it. Where in reality, many of us just kept what we already were given. We kept it, we were born into it. And then there are people that just didn't have that type of access. And so it can be this attitude that I'm going to do this for you. And that is a paternalistic posture. And I don't want to stop people from that loving mercy, because there's a little bit of a hinge. But if you're doing it for someone, for whom are you doing it? Are you doing it for them? Are you doing it for yourself? And are you going to go on to do it with someone? So I think the power of proximity, it's not that you have to read a book in order to go to that next step, but I do think it's a gentle walk to really messing with your head, your theology, your experience, in the sense that I really want to move beyond myself and the emotions that I have for the brokenness of others, and really enter and meet them in their brokenness and join them. If they're not crying about it and they want to run, you run with them. If they want to forget that horrible things are happening and their family member just got deported last year and they're going to be missing this celebration, they're like, I had my moment. Now I just want you to stop thinking about it. I want you to beat the pinata, and I want you to, jump in the brink of brick and like, be here, be joyful with me. And for the times that I feel really, really sad and I need to weep, then cry with me. And so that's part of it, is that we need to join people where they're at and not mirror their emotions, but minister with their emotions and not make it about us. And I wonder if that's really even what was meant with, we rejoice with those who rejoice and we weep with those who weep. We make it about joining you in your response and in your needs. And even if I feel overwhelmed and undone about your circumstances, that may compel me to be in a relationship and really want to move to a deeper level of engagement and repair. But I don't do anything to you, and I don't do anything outside of you. I do it with you, and we can dream together and see what it is that we want to do in order that no injustice and brokenness needs to continue to be perpetuated in your life and in this community.
Yeah. We could keep going on this for a long time, I think, but I also want to think. I also want to think about. So you brought up the power of proximity. You also had and joined the resistance earlier in the conversation, and brought up working at Denver Seminary. All of those I see as like helping to resource individuals for pursuing justice. So when you think about each of those different things, how do you approach resourcing people for the work of justice?
I'm actually not that great at it. So let me just tell you, I need to work on it. And I've been kind of feeling that way. Like, oh, I really need to. I put together a writing team, and we have been working on a curriculum at the intersection of justice and mission, because often those two words in the church, especially in academia and in writing, they get thrown together. But I don't even know if the church knows what justice is, if it even intersects with mission. And we have such a limited view of the mission of God and missional living. To us, we hear mission, we're like, oh, missionaries. I give my money so that they can go to, Africa or some other place. Whereas what does it really mean for the justice of God and mission to intersect? And what does that look like? So I'm only just kind of getting into thinking, how do I resource the church? And so other than putting a writing team together and beginning to frame it out, I think we're still a couple years from it landing. But you're right. At Denver Seminary, I was asked to teach probably about 15 years ago. It's been maybe 13 or 14 years that I've been teaching, and I was resistant to it, Eric, I'll be honest. mostly because I'm a practitioner. It doesn't mean that I don't have any academic chops, but I don't like the idea of getting stodgy and dusty. You know, it's just, I'm just a doer. I mean, I am wanting to be in the work. And so it's been a gift to land the work in an academic setting and to be able to transfer it. You know, it's writing for me is, I don't have writer's block or ever lack anything to write, but I have a lot of lack of wanting to and sitting and disciplining myself to do it. And and so those are basically been my gift to the church, is those books. And my course is teaching people like you and other up and coming pastors and ministry leaders on how do you address the social concerns of the church with the work of justice. And of course, I have opportunities to speak and teach and do workshops and run some cohorts. And so maybe it seems like I'm equipping it, but I actually need to grow in that area. I know there's a lot of things out there. It's almost like the practitioners and the justice writers and speakers. You brought up Nick Wolterstorff. I'm not going to criticize him. I don't know anything about his life, but he is highly academic, and that's been a majority, uber majority. So even if it started with a practitioner base, it led to academia. You know, for me, it was practitioner that barely tickled academia and jumped out for fear that, you know, I might get stuck into faculty meetings or something. But all to say that there is good material out there, but there's no substitute for learning from people who are doing the work on the ground. You know, it's fine if you want to go give a meal to people and, oh, we're going to get our youth group and we're just going to go down to this street that we know homeless people are, you know, and so we're going to give to them. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. I would not stop anybody. But that's really, we don't need more people coming up with their own solutions on how to do things to people. It would be even more appropriate to call a nonprofit that works with people who don't have homes, um, you know, or don't have housing rather, to find out, how can I join you in your work? Is there a way for me? I was thinking about doing this. What do you think? You know, that just takes humility. And they might say, you know, we really don't need 15 teenagers delivering sandwiches, but we care about your kids' discipleship. Why don't you do this instead? And then you're building a lasting relationship. So a young person, her mom, I guess the pastor of a big megachurch in Littleton, Colorado, started to be more aware of open door ministries. At least the wife did, for sure. And she wanted her family to begin to serve a meal at one of our transitional homes. So once a month, she and her daughters, and sometimes her husband, the pastor, would go down, and they wouldn't just serve a meal, they'd sit in the dining room and they'd eat with them. And it was uncomfortable. I mean, like, what do women who are coming out of prostitution, drug addiction, and homelessness have anything to do with, you know, kids who've grown up in Douglas County, which is one of the wealthiest counties in the country? But in those conversations, it really, you begin to find your humanity. Things that make you laugh together, food that you do or do not like to eat. You know, you begin to develop a relationship. And what ended up happening is that one of the girls grew up and she went to Wheaton and spent all of her weekends doing outreach in downtown Chicago. And she was my intern twice, 2 summers in a row, because she couldn't get enough of Open Door Ministries. And when she graduated, she became a full-time staff member, and her life and vocation was utterly changed because she didn't just have one experience where mom's like, well, you know, I'm feeling really upset that there's poor people. Let's just go find some poor people to do things to them. But it was more like, how can we walk alongside an organization that's walking alongside people and really make change? And it's not necessarily just about the young woman who grew up, you know, but all of the different points of influence along the way. And I'm just saying, it's a shared journey and it's a shared discipleship. And when we begin to have that posture of with and accompaniment versus doing things to people and doing things for people rather, then we're really talking about some transformative work in the body of Christ and overcoming evil with good.
Yeah. So how then, how do I want to form this question? So how so you as a practitioner are doing this work daily. This is your vocation.
Daily, yes, this is my vocation and my job.
What does it look like for people who do not have that then as their vocation? What does it look like to engage this for them? I mean, you just
Yeah.
gave an example of a group of people who didn't start out that way and then one of them moved into that work. What does it look like to be a banker or be a school teacher or be a do landscape? I don't know. Pick
Yeah,
your
being
pick your
curious.
vocation. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're gonna have to do a little bit of work, all right? Just like you know, had to research schools to go to become a banker, or research jobs and all of that effort to get your job, it's gonna take a little bit of work. It takes a willingness to say, Lord, use me. Now, that is probably the scariest part. It's like, oh, I don't know if I want that. That's gonna open up a whole whirlwind of stuff. And that's probably true. I mean, that's the whole point, is it starts with prayer and that starts with discernment. God, can you give me the eyes that you have for others and see where he opens it up? You know, this one gentleman, he was an oil and gas guy in Denver and began to realize that he needed to open up his heart, came in contact. He was, I think there was an organization that was feeding people on the 16th Street Mall. And so he was doing that. Anyway, he got to know David. And long story short, Dave put him on his board. I mean, wouldn't you want an oil and gas guy who is trying to care about the poor on your board? Yeah, you totally do. So that's one way of being able to lean in and say, you know, I've looked at your organization and I'm starting to donate. I've been donating for a year. I've been coming to everything that you've had. I want you to know if you ever need a board member, I'm open. Okay, that is something that people don't even think about, but that is something that you can do. However, this guy, every week, 1 or 2 days a week, he would, during his lunch hour, instead of having his power lunches and or skipping it so he could work, took the discipline to go down the 7 blocks or whatever it is from where his office was on 16th Street to come down to Open Door, and he read to preschoolers. And it was transformative, because he'd go back to his work. Oh, I read to preschoolers, and he would just tell funny antics. And he was literally spreading light everywhere, from his home in Highlands Ranch to his office to his church, all because all he was doing, which is not a small thing, but in his busy schedule, was reading books to preschoolers. He wasn't too important in his multi thousands of dollars worth of, you know, a suit, like $1,000 or more suit, to sit on the floor of Open Door and sit with kids who were, you know, waiting to get into to kindergarten, but were on, you know, sort of the free meals and on Medicaid and on, you know, TANF and SNAP, sitting in our preschool, whether it was hot in the summer or cold in the winter, or having to literally, why did I even drive? You know, I have to park 3 blocks away. I might have just walked. But putting that into his practice of service, he was incredible. He loved Open Door Ministries. He was generous, not just with his resources of time and money, but he was generous in spreading the work. It was so contagious. Everybody around him knew about it and wanted to be a part of it too. I think we just need to be creative. I don't think we need to know where we're going to be in 3 years or 5 years or if it's going to make a difference. I think we need to open up ourselves to what God is trying to break in our own heart, our own darkness with his light, to ask him to give us a curious and courageous spirit. And are there small ways that we can be transformed as we, you know, meet him in the poor, in the incarcerated, in the immigrant, in the widow, the orphan. I mean, just read Matthew 25, the sheep and the goats. You know, there's three. Let me just say this. Matthew 24, Jesus is saying he's leaving, he's coming back. He's talking about the return of Christ. Um, and he gives us 3 ways to live. You know, the first one is the oil, kind of be ready, I'm coming. Don't not be prepared. This is really happening. You know, the second one is the bag of the talents, or the parable of the talents rather. And I grew up in a wealthier community, well-resourced, really well-resourced community. And I was always taught that because I had a lot of resources, my bag, I would have gotten 10. In an upside down kingdom, I actually think I came from the community that had one. I was so rich in this world. I had some wealth in Christ, but I didn't need God as much as the poor and the broken and the immigrant and the migrant and the stranger. But regardless, we are commanded to invest what we have, to not bury what God gives us, and not bury, and to recognize that the pain that we feel, even if it's just a tinge, that doesn't seem fair, that we need to not bury that, but we need to multiply it. God, what are you doing? Okay, you've given me this hurt. How can I invest it so that the hurt will grow so much? Not that I'm overcome and depressed, but that I can be activated, that I can be investing in your kingdom. So that's the second parable. And the third one, just in case we don't know where to invest, we've got the parable of the sheep and the goats. It is very clear. It's sort of the alignment of Isaiah 58. It's the New Testament, passage of Isaiah 58 really saying, you know, you need to pay the imprisoned, the hungry, all these lists, and then you find out that when you do that, you meet me. Lord, when did we see you in prison? When did we see you hungry? When did we see you a stranger? Whatever you do for those people, the least of these, you've done it for me. And so we meet Christ in our service alongside people, understanding our brokenness, our need, our humanity that intersects with theirs. And hallelujah, it doesn't just stay there. It transforms us so that we can be appropriately investing our life, our energy, everything God has given us for the multiplication of his kingdom here on earth, just like it is in heaven.
Amen. So this may be just looking at our time here. Probably this will be our last question, and might have to bring you back at some point to answer all the other questions that have been coming up for me. But we've thought, I think, a lot here in this conversation about an individual approaching this individual, whether individual approaching of other individuals, individual approaching a system. What does it look like as the church, as more broadly, more corporately, to engage this? Whether it be a person in a church who feels like they need to try and bring their church along with them, or a church who is all on board with the mission and moving forward. What does it look like corporately to approach this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really powerful. Where an individual's desire, whether it's the pastor or, a child or someone who is, like my friend from the oil and gas industry, whose church could not help to know about, open door ministries and the good work that they were doing. I mean, I think that's the collective chorus. What it moves from I to we. That's basic community organizer. Who am I and why am I here? Who are we and why are we here? And then that fifth question is, what do we want to do? And so that, I think, like I said, it's kind of coming in that journey, that accompaniment, that slow work. I'll give you, there's short, loving mercy and outreach. And I think we need to always be doing that, but I don't think we need to stop there. I think you've heard me on this podcast long enough to know that we need to be willing to say yes, even if it makes us uncomfortable. Because that was my story. I am very well versed in the politics of the public square. I had no intention of ever doing that. I was a very good girl. Enneagram 1, told you I was trained to be a good Pharisee. Like, I knew the rules and I excelled at them. And that's how I got stars, and rewards in community, is by following the rules. That's mostly what grades are, turning your paper in on time. Wow. So this is not in my DNA. I'm actually historically, like, if you go back to me, pretty fearful. And so when I'm saying opening up all of this, being willing to ask those tough questions and allowing God to move you, even if you break cultural lines. And one of the biggest cultural, and I would say it almost has probably even used like demonic stronghold on the church, is this idea that I can only go so far so long as I don't get political. And so I would say corporately, be willing to go all in. Don't just be the church that donates to the open door ministries of the world and goes down and cancels their service on a Sunday and all has matching t-shirts and, does landscaping, or goes down once a month and does part of the feeding outreach program. Keep walking alongside people, become a mentor, become a board member, become a regular volunteer, a tutor. Have your whole church say, this is who we are. We are learning from the practitioners of the church and joining them and following their lead. And wow, now we're getting kind of political. I'm not saying run to the darkness of politics. I don't mean that. I just mean if you're truly going to love your neighbor as yourself, you're going to do everything in your mental, emotional, and physical bodies to make sure that things are right. And if it means you're crossing political lines, it's not anything different than crossing over on that Jericho road to truly help and love the half-dead, beaten up person on the side of it. And then realizing I've been on this road so long, rescuing, half-dead, beaten up people on the side of the road, that what is wrong with this road? And instead of figuring out how to fix the road, look at all the other people who are actually living along that who are being perpetually scared that they're going to be left for dead. How do we together work to change the road so that no one has to be perpetually left for half dead? Those kinds of things will get you into some scary, not wrong, but I need courage because I've never done this before, kinds of behaviors and postures. And I will just say, take it from me. I was a kid born scared. I made up reasons to be terrified. And, I remember sitting in Dr. John Perkins' house when I was in my 30s, and I'd been doing the work for a while. And I was just stepping into the next unfamiliar and scary thing, not because I loved it, but because I was compelled literally by the love of Christ to do it and to obey, even if it didn't feel culturally right. But I remember him just sitting there and he kind of just made this comment, and I could not believe I stopped Dr. John Perkins. For those of you who don't know it, you need to know Dr. John Perkins is like the MLK of the Christian justice movement of the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. And so I was like, Dr. Perkins, what did you just say? Because I wanted to write it down word for word. And what he had said was, courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is living your convictions in the face of it. So whether it's individual or corporate, you're going to have to continue to take up courage to do the long, loving work of mercy and justice, not or, and.
Amen again. Give you as many as I can here. I'd love to continue going, but we'll go ahead and stop there. So thank you, Michelle, for joining me here today.
Thank you for listening to the Biblical Justice Resources Podcast. This podcast is hosted, produced, and edited by Eric Beck. To learn more about how you can be resourced for the pursuit of biblical justice, visit our website at biblicaljusticeresources.com.